I don't know what's happening to the month. All I can tell you is that it just seems to be really running ahead. Yesterday I went back and looked at the video that I did, and I spoke on, I think it was like almost 20 minutes, and I'm thinking, man, everybody doesn't need to hear from me for 20 minutes. So today I'm going to try and speed it up. And I talked to you about the fact that we started talking about Abraham because of the fact that America has been instrumental, I believe, in helping to put together this latest peace initiative between the UAE and Israel. And I said that as long as America acts to bless Israel, then I believe we're going to experience God's blessing, and that's from Genesis 12:3. And I'll bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee. And I really do believe that. I believe that as a church, as a ministry, as an individual, if you want to be blessed, we need to bless God's chosen people. And then I told you, that Abraham is talked about as being a friend of God, and I said, man, wouldn't you like to be called a friend of God? I know I would. But that leads to the question, well, why was he a friend of God? What did he do? What was it about his life that made him a friend? And so, we focus on Genesis 12:3, but I want to go back a couple of verses and just talk to you for a moment about Genesis 12:1. And it said, now the Lord has said unto Abraham, get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show you. And so here's God telling Abraham to do four things. He's, first of all, telling him to leave his country, leave his people, leave his father's household, and go to somewhere I will show you. And, that's not an easy thing. Abraham was being asked to forsake everything that he had, everything that he knew, in order to follow God's call. And so the question is, what would you have done? Would you have done that? I like to think that I would have done. And I think there's been times in our life where we've heard the voice of God and we've tried to act on it. But there's other times when I've said, Lord, is that really you? And, the reality is the command given to Abraham came at a time when he was in the prime of his life. I told you that people live longer in this day. He had a good income, I assume. He was a prosperous person. He had a home he liked, friends he admired. He was with his family, and you're an upstanding part of the community, and it looks like you've got a good future ahead of you. And then what happens? The last thing you really want to hear is you're to move. But one day, God speaks to him. And we're not told how he spoke to him. I don't know whether he spoke to him audibly or however. But all that we know is that the voice of God comes to Abraham, and it says, go and leave everything. So I read the other day of a sort of amusing paraphrase of how that conversation might have gone. And it was God speaking. Abraham, this is God speaking. Right. Who is it really? It's me, the I am. And I want you to leave everything and go to the land that I will show you. Abraham says, and where's that? And God replied, if I told you, you wouldn't believe me. Abraham, try me. Well, it's in a place called Canaan. Never heard of it. I know, and guess what else? I'm going to make you the father of a great nation. Abraham replies, that's impossible. I don't have any children. And God says, don't worry. What do you mean, don't worry? God, just trust me. So Abraham, let's see if I've got this right. You want me to leave everything, travel across to some place I've never heard of, become the father of a great nation. And the Lord replies, right. And Abraham says, is this some kind of a joke? God, no. Abraham, what am I supposed to tell my wife? And God says, that's your problem. Well, I don't know what went on. Maybe Abraham just knew it was God. Maybe there was no skepticism. But it does tell us that in Hebrews chapter 11 verse 8 it says, by faith Abraham, when he was called to go out to a place which he should after receive from inheritance, obeyed, and he went out not knowing whither he went. So there's Abraham, his first interaction with God as far as we know, and he's told to go somewhere. He doesn't know exactly where it is. And I think that's the reality a lot of the time. When God tells us to do something, he rarely lays out the whole plan. He tells us the next thing, or he impresses on us what we should be doing. Many times we're called to step out for God, but it's in faith. And when you do that, you'll be exactly where Abraham was, having to trust, to believe God, but not knowing what the future holds. There's some part of everyday life that relies on faith. When you're ill, you go to a doctor, and oftentimes you can't pronounce his name. He gives you a prescription you can't read. You take it to a pharmacist you've never personally met. He gives you the medication, and you do not properly understand it all, and yet you take it. Why? Because that's living by faith. You are believing and you're being obedient. There was a Bible translator who was living in some remote part of the world, and he was trying to translate the Bible, and he was struggling to find an equivalent word in their language for obedience. Well, one day as he returned to the village, he whistled for his dog, and it came running to him at full speed. And one of the natives, seeing this, said to the man in his native tongue, "Your dog is all ear." And immediately the translator knew what he had to incorporate in that word for obedience, because obedience is both listening and doing. Many years ago, I had a friend. You may have known him. You may have heard of him. His name was Dr. Ed Cole, and I remember him saying, "Obedience is an act of faith. Disobedience is the result of unbelief." So when I look at Abraham, time and time again, we're going to see that Abraham was obedient. And rarely did he know how the story was going to turn out. We're going to come back and talk tomorrow about probably the greatest act of obedience any of us have ever heard of. You know what I'm talking about, as Abraham prepared to offer his own son. And then we're going to find that when Abraham acted in obedience, God gave him a promise. Now, I'll come back and talk about it tomorrow. But I believe that every time we act in obedience, and as I've said, obedience and faith are intermingled, right? Many times being obedient requires you to act in faith. And as Ed Cole says, when we fail to obey, or when we're disobedient, it's an act of unbelief. So tomorrow we'll talk a little more about Abraham. But I don't know about you, I would love to be at the place where when I heard God's voice, I recognized it and I was obedient, even if I didn't understand how it properly was going to pan out. So that's my thought for the day, albeit a little briefer than yesterday. We sure love you. We're praying for you, hoping and praying that you're doing well. And I'll come back and talk to you again tomorrow. God bless you. Bye-bye.